Before you could enjoy a bite of bread in 1350, you had to battle the earth, the fire, and time itself. From grinding rock-hard grain by hand to starting a fire with damp wood, to kneading dough in a smoky corner of a dirt floor kitchen, every step was a test of strength and patience. All that for a loaf that might still come out flat, burnt, or stolen by the neighbor's goat. If stories like these make you grateful for toasters, you're not alone. Hit the subscribe button and tap the bell icon for more cozy, crusty tales from the past. And tell us in the comments, could you handle baking just one loaf the medieval way? In the year 1350, as dawn breaks over the English countryside, you find yourself walking beside a medieval peasant named Willem as he makes his way to the fields that will sustain his village through another harsh winter. The air is crisp with the promise of spring, and in his weathered hands, he carries precious seeds that represent not just sustenance, but survival itself. Each grain of wheat in his leather pouch has been carefully selected, saved from the previous year's harvest through months of careful storage in the manor's granary, protected from moisture, rodents, and the ever-present threat of spoilage. The three-field system that governs Willem's world is a marvel of medieval agricultural organization that you might find surprisingly sophisticated. As you observe the layout of the village lands, you notice how the community's survival depends on this careful rotation of crops and fallow periods. One field lies empty this year, allowing the soil to recover its fertility through the mysterious process that medieval farmers understand through generations of observation rather than scientific theory. Another field will be planted with spring crops, barley for ale, oats for the horses, and legumes like peas and beans that somehow, though medieval farmers don't know why, restore richness to the soil. But it's the third field that commands Willem's attention today, for this is where the wheat will grow. The golden grain that will become the flour, that will become the bread, that will keep his family alive. The decision of which variety of wheat to plant is not taken lightly in this world where crop failure means death. Willem's community grows what we might call landdress wheat, varieties that have adapted over centuries to local conditions. Unlike the uniform grain you know from modern agriculture, medieval wheat comes in diverse forms, each with its own characteristics and purposes. The most prized variety is what they call white wheat, though it would appear quite different from modern wheat to your eyes. This grain, with its slightly higher gluten content, will produce the finest flour and the whitest bread, a luxury reserved for the Lord's table and special occasions. More common is the hardier red wheat, darker in color and more resistant to the harsh conditions that characterize medieval agriculture. This grain will become the daily bread of the common people, substantial and nourishing, though coarser in texture than the refined loaves enjoyed by the nobility. As Willem prepares the soil, you witness the back-breaking labor that precedes every meal in medieval times. His wooden plow, pulled by a team of oxen shared with several other villagers, cuts furrows in earth that has been farmed by his ancestors for generations. The plowshare, one of the few iron tools in his possession, has been carefully maintained by the village blacksmith, for without it, the hard clay soil of England would remain impenetrable to planting. The timing of this spring planting follows rhythms far older than Christianity, though the Church has overlaid its calendar upon these ancient cycles. Willem plants by the phases of the moon, following traditions passed down from his grandfather's grandfather, believing that certain phases encourage root growth while others promote healthy stems and leaves. Whether or not these beliefs hold scientific merit, they represent centuries of careful observation and adaptation to local conditions. You observe how the community works together in this crucial task. The planting of the grain fields is not an individual enterprise, but a collective effort involving every member of the village. Women and children follow behind the plow, dropping seeds into the freshly turned earth with careful precision. 2. Many seeds in one spot, and the plants will compete for nutrients. Too few. and the field will not produce enough grain to sustain the community through the winter ahead. The seeds themselves tell a story of survival and selection that spans generations. Each kernel in Willem's pouch represents a genetic lineage, stretching back centuries, carefully preserved by farmers who understood, without modern science to guide them, which plants produce the best grain. They selected for size, for resistance to disease, for ability to survive late frosts and early snows. They understood that the wheat that grew best in their particular soil, under their specific conditions, was worth its weight in gold. As the planting continues through the spring days, you begin to understand the precarious nature of medieval agriculture. There are no backup plans, no insurance policies, no global supply chains to fall back on if this harvest fails. The grain being planted today will either sustain the community for another year or condemn them to hunger and possible starvation. This knowledge infuses every aspect of the planting process with a solemnity that transcends mere agricultural work. The preparation of the seed itself has been a careful process spanning months. After the previous year's harvest, the best grains were selected not for immediate consumption, but for this moment. They were stored in the manor's granary, protected from moisture by placement in large wooden chests lined with straw, and guarded against rodents by the village cats, whose role in medieval agriculture is as crucial as that of the oxen. The seeds were tested periodically through the winter, with small samples planted in pots by the hearth to ensure their viability. As you watch Willem work, you notice the careful attention he pays to every detail. The depth of planting must be just right. Too shallow and the seeds will be eaten by birds or fail to establish strong roots. Too deep and they may not have the energy to reach the surface. The spacing must be precise, though medieval farmers measure not with rulers, but with practiced steps and the width of a man's hand. These measurements, passed down through generations, represent accumulated wisdom about what works in this particular place. Under these specific conditions, the weather plays a role in every decision. Willem watches the skies constantly, interpreting cloud formations and wind patterns with the skill of a modern meteorologist. A late frost could destroy the young shoots. Too much rain could rot the seeds before they germinate. Too little rain could leave them struggling in dry soil. He knows, with the certainty that comes from a lifetime of observation, that the success or failure of this planting will depend as much on forces beyond his control as on his own careful preparation. But what strikes you most profoundly as you observe this ancient process is the profound connection between the people and their food. Willem doesn't simply plant wheat. He partners with the earth itself, working within natural cycles and limitations that modern agriculture often seeks to overcome. He understands that he is part of a chain of dependency that stretches from the soil beneath his feet to the bread on his family's table, and that each link in this chain must be strong for the whole system to survive. Yet even as Willem completes the spring planting, larger questions loom over the medieval agricultural world. How will these precious seeds be transformed from grain to flour? What mysteries await in the mill where stone meets stone to create the powder that will become bread? As spring gives way to summer in this year of 1350, you find yourself returning to Willem's fields, now transformed by weeks of sun and rain into a sea of green shoots reaching toward the sky. But what you discover is that the work of grain production has only just begun. The medieval farmer's relationship with his wheat is not one of planting and forgetting, but of constant vigilance, daily care, and intimate knowledge of every plant's progress. The young wheat plants face enemies at every turn, and Willem's role has shifted from planter to protector. You observe him walking the field edges at dawn, checking for signs of the rust fungus that can devastate an entire crop within weeks. This disease, which appears as reddish-brown spots on the wheat leaves, is one of the most feared threats in medieval agriculture. Willem knows the signs intimately. The way infected plants seem to shimmer differently in morning light, the subtle change in leaf color that precedes widespread crop failure. When he finds infected plants, he pulls them immediately, burning them far from the field to prevent the spread of spores. But rust is only one threat among many. The young wheat must be protected from the depredations of birds, particularly the flocks of sparrows and finches that would strip the fields bare if left unchecked. Children from the village take turns as bird scarers. Stationed in the fields from dawn to dusk with noisemakers made from pots and wooden clappers. This might seem like simple work, but you come to understand that these children are the first line of defense for the community's survival. Their vigilance during these crucial weeks will determine whether there will be bread on the table come winter. Weeds present another constant challenge. Without modern herbicides, Willem and his family wage a daily battle against the wild plants that compete with wheat for soil nutrients and sunlight. You watch as they work their way through the field rows, carefully identifying and removing dandelions, dock, and wild oats. This is delicate work. Pulling weeds too aggressively can damage the wheat roots, but leaving them can reduce the harvest by half or more. The weeding process reveals the intimate knowledge medieval farmers possessed about their crops. Willem can distinguish between dozens of different weed species, knowing which ones pose the greatest threat and which can be tolerated in small numbers. He understands that some weeds, like clover, actually improve the soil, while others, like wild oats, are so difficult to separate from wheat at harvest time that they can contaminate the entire crop. Weather remains the great unknown factor that shapes every decision. Too little rain during the critical growing phase will stunt the wheat and reduce grain production. Too much rain can cause the plants to grow too tall and weak, making them susceptible to a condition called lodging, where entire sections of the field fall over before harvest, making the grain nearly impossible to collect. Willem watches the sky constantly, reading cloud patterns and wind directions with the skill of a professional meteorologist. You begin to notice the subtle signs that Willem uses to assess his crop's progress. The color of the leaves tells him about nutrient levels in the soil. The thickness of the stalks indicates whether the plants are developing properly. The timing of flowering reveals whether the harvest will be early or late. Crucial information for planning the complex logistics of bringing in the crop as midsummer approaches. The wheat begins to show its grain heads, and Willem's vigilance intensifies. This is the period when the actual wheat kernels are forming, and any stress on the plants now will directly impact the final harvest. He checks soil moisture levels by digging small holes with his knife, feeling the earth to ensure it's neither too wet nor too dry. He examines individual plants for signs of pest damage, particularly from the wheat midge, tiny insects whose larvae can destroy developing grains. The community aspect of medieval farming becomes even more apparent during this growing season. Information about pest outbreaks, unusual weather patterns, or crop diseases spreads quickly from farm to farm. When one farmer spots a problem, the entire community mobilizes to address it. You witness meetings where farmers share observations about soil conditions, debate the timing of various agricultural activities, and collectively decide on strategies for protecting their crops. The interdependence of medieval agriculture extends beyond just the farming community. The lord of the manor takes a keen interest in crop progress, as his own prosperity depends on the success of his tenants' harvests. His reeve, or overseer, makes regular rounds of the fields, assessing crop conditions and ensuring that proper farming techniques are being followed. This isn't mere supervision. The reeve often provides advice based on conditions observed across multiple farms, sharing knowledge that individual farmers might not possess as summer progresses. You observe Willem making crucial decisions about crop management. Some fields may be grazed by sheep or cattle after the grain harvest, But the timing must be perfect. Too early, and the animals will damage the developing grain. Too late, and they won't have time to properly manure the field for next year's planting. These decisions require Willem to think not just about this year's harvest, but about the long-term fertility of his soil. The growing season also reveals the different varieties of wheat being cultivated in the same village. You notice that Willem's neighbor grows a different type of grain, one that matures slightly earlier but produces smaller kernels. This diversity isn't accidental. It's a survival strategy developed over generations. By growing multiple varieties with different characteristics, the community reduces the risk that a single weather event or disease outbreak will destroy the entire food supply. Tool maintenance becomes crucial during the growing season. Willem spends evening hours repairing the wooden handles of his hoes and weeding tools, sharpening iron blades, and preparing the equipment that will be needed for harvest. Every tool must be ready when the critical moment arrives, because the window for successful harvesting is often measured in days, rather than weeks. The social rhythms of medieval life also adapt to the agricultural calendar. Community celebrations and religious festivals are timed around crucial agricultural activities. Prayers for good weather and successful harvests become daily rituals, reflecting the recognition that human effort alone cannot guarantee success in this precarious system of food production. As summer reaches its peak and the wheat heads begin to fill with grain, Willem's attention turns to the complex calculations required for harvest planning. He must coordinate with neighbors for sharing labor and equipment, arrange for temporary storage of the harvested grain, and begin preparing for the intensive work that lies ahead. The success of months of careful tending will soon be tested. In the few critical days when the grain must be cut, gathered, and processed before weather or pests can destroy the year's work. Yet, questions remain about what happens to this carefully tended grain once it leaves the field. How will these precious kernels be transformed into the flour that will sustain the community through another winter? What ancient arts and closely guarded secrets await at the village mill? By late July of 1350, the wheat fields have transformed from green seas into waves of gold that ripple in the summer breeze. You find yourself witnessing one of the most critical periods in the medieval agricultural year, the harvest, a time when months of careful cultivation must be gathered in. A matter of days before weather, pests, or simple overripening can destroy the entire crop. The urgency is palpable as Willem examines his grain, testing kernels between his teeth to determine the perfect moment for cutting. The decision of when to begin harvest requires expertise passed down through generations. Cut too early, and the grain will be soft and prone to spoilage. Wait too long, and the kernels will shatter and fall to the ground at the slightest touch. Willem rubs wheat heads between his palms, listening to the sound the kernels make, feeling their firmness, even tasting them to judge their moisture content. These sensory evaluations, refined over centuries of practice, are more reliable than any modern instrument in determining the optimal harvest moment. The cutting begins at dawn, when the cool morning air makes the grain less likely to shatter. You observe Willem and his family working with tools that would be familiar to farmers from centuries past. The sickle, a curved blade attached to a short wooden handle, requires the harvester to grasp bundles of wheat stalks with one hand while cutting with the other. Back-breaking work that must be sustained for days. The more efficient scythe, with its long handle and sweeping motion, can cover ground more quickly, but requires considerable skill to avoid cutting the grain too short or leaving stubble too high. The rhythm of medieval harvest reveals itself as a carefully choreographed community effort. While Willem cuts, his wife Margaret follows behind, gathering the cut wheat into small bundles called sheaves. Their children tie these sheaves with twisted straw, creating bundles that can be easily transported and stacked. The timing of each step must be precise. The cut grain cannot be left loose in the field overnight where dew might cause it to spoil. Yet the bundles must not be tied. so tightly that air cannot circulate and dry the grain properly. Weather dominates every decision. During harvest time, a sudden thunderstorm can flatten fields of grain, making collection nearly impossible. High winds can cause ripe kernels to shatter and scatter. Even too much sun can be problematic, making the grain so dry that it becomes brittle and difficult to handle. Willem constantly scans the sky, reading cloud formations and wind patterns, adjusting the pace of work to match nature's moods. The communal nature of medieval agriculture becomes most apparent during harvest. Neighbors who may have had disputes throughout the year set aside their differences to help each other bring in the crops. The harvest crew moves from farm to farm, ensuring that no one's grain is lost due to lack of labor. This cooperation isn't simply charitable, it's a survival strategy in a world where next year's food security depends on successfully completing this year's harvest. You witness the complex logistics involved in moving grain from field to storage. Horse-drawn carts, their wooden wheels creaking under heavy loads. Transport sheaves to the manor's threshing floor, a carefully prepared area where the grain will be separated from the straw. The timing of these trips must account for the condition of the roads, the availability of carts and draft animals, and the need to protect the grain from rain during transport. The threshing process itself is a marvel of medieval efficiency. The sheaves are spread on a hard-packed earth floor and beaten with flails to wooden sticks connected by leather hinges that allow for precise striking force. The rhythmic pounding echoes across the countryside as teams of workers separate grain from straw through coordinated effort. This is skilled work, requiring years of practice to achieve the proper force and rhythm that separates kernels without damaging them. After threshing comes winnowing, perhaps the most elegant process in medieval grain production. Using large, woven baskets, workers toss the threshed grain into the air on windy days, allowing the breeze to carry away the lighter chaff while the heavier kernels fall back into the baskets. This process must be repeated multiple times to achieve grain clean enough for storage, and it requires an intimate understanding of wind patterns and grain characteristics. The quality assessment of the harvested grain reveals the sophisticated understanding medieval farmers possessed about their crops. Different grades of wheat are carefully separated, the finest, whitest kernels reserved for the Lord's table, while darker or smaller grains are designated for different purposes. Damaged or diseased kernels are removed entirely, as their inclusion could contaminate stored grain or affect the quality of flour produced from the batch. Storage preparation begins even before the harvest is complete. The granary, typically located on the manor grounds, must be thoroughly cleaned and inspected for signs of rodent activity. Wooden storage chests are lined with fresh straw and treated with herbs believed to deter insects. The grain must be completely dry before storage, as any residual moisture can lead to mold or rot that will destroy the entire supply. The measurement and recording of the harvest reveals the complex obligations and relationships that govern medieval agricultural life. A portion of every harvest belongs to the lord of the manor as rent for the land. Another portion must be set aside as seed for next year's planting. The church expects its tithe, typically 1/10 of the crop. What remains must sustain the farming family through the coming year, with careful calculations determining how much can be consumed immediately, and how much must be preserved for the lean months of late winter and early spring. The social and religious significance of harvest time permeates every aspect of the process. The successful completion of harvest is marked by community celebrations that acknowledge both human effort and divine blessing. Harvest festivals, with their mixture of thanksgiving and relief, recognize that the community successfully completed another cycle in the eternal struggle for survival. Yet even as the grain fills the manor's granaries, Lem knows that his work is far from finished. The carefully harvested wheat represents potential rather than sustenance. before it can become the bread that will feed his family through the winter, must undergo another transformation entirely, one that will take place in the domain of the miller, where ancient stones and flowing water will grind grain into flour through processes as old as civilization itself. The golden kernels now safely stored represent not just food, but the continuation of life itself in medieval society. But how? Will these precious grains be transformed into the flour that forms the foundation of medieval sustenance? What mysteries and expertise await at the mill, where miller's craft meets the power of nature? In the year 1350, as autumn mists rise from the stream that powers Thornwell Manor's ancient mill, you find yourself approaching one of the most crucial yet mysterious structures in medieval society. The miller, Robert de Mulner, stands silhouetted against the dawn sky as he inspects the great wooden wheel that harnesses the river's power, transforming the steady flow of water into the circular motion that will grind Willem's carefully harvested wheat into flour. This building, with its massive stone foundations and timber frame weathered by decades of service, represents technology that has remained essentially unchanged since Roman times, yet requires expertise that few possess and fewer still understand. The mill itself is a marvel of medieval engineering that you might easily underestimate at first glance. The building straddles the stream at a carefully chosen point, where the water flows with consistent force throughout most of the year. A stone dam upstream creates a mill pond that regulates water flow and provides the steady pressure needed to turn the great wheel. The wheel itself, constructed of oak timbers and iron reinforcements, stands nearly 20 feet in diameter, its wooden paddles precisely angled to catch the maximum force from the controlled stream of water that pours from the mill race. Inside the mill, the complexity of the machinery becomes apparent. The water wheel's rotation is transferred through a series of wooden gears and iron mechanisms to the millstones above. These stones, each weighing more than a ton, represent an investment, equivalent to several years' income for a prosperous farmer. The lower stone, called the bedstone, remains stationary while the upper stone, or runner stone, rotates at precisely the right speed to grind grain without generating so much heat that it damages the flour's quality. Robert himself embodies contradictions that defines his role in medieval society. As the miller, he possesses skills that make him indispensable to every person in the community. Without his expertise, the carefully harvested grain cannot become bread. Yet millers are viewed with suspicion, even contempt, by many of their neighbors. The old saying, "honest miller," is considered an oxymoron by medieval standards, reflecting widespread belief that millers routinely cheat their customers by taking more than their fair share of grain or by mixing inferior flour with good. The source of this mistrust becomes apparent as you observe Robert's daily work. When villagers bring their grain to be ground, they must trust the miller's measurements and calculations entirely. The farmer delivers a sack of wheat and returns later to collect flour, having no way to verify that the amount received corresponds fairly to the grain originally brought. The miller's traditional payment, called multure, typically amounts to 1/16 of the flour, produced a substantial fee that villagers pay reluctantly but cannot avoid, as the lord of the manor holds a monopoly on grain milling that forces all tenants to use his mill. The legal and economic framework surrounding medieval milling reveals the complex power relationships that govern daily life in 1350. The mill monopoly, or soak, grants the lord exclusive rights to operate grain mills within his territory, while requiring all residents to bring their grain for processing. This arrangement generates substantial income for the manor, while ensuring that the expensive mill machinery remains profitable. Attempting to grind grain elsewhere or using hand mills at home can result in heavy fines or other punishments. Robert's knowledge extends far beyond simply operating the mill machinery. He must understand the characteristics of different grains and how they respond to grinding. Wheat requires different treatment than barley or oats, Grain that is too wet will clog the stones and produce poor flour. Grain that is too dry will generate excessive dust and heat. The spacing between the millstones must be adjusted constantly based on the type of grain being processed and the desired fineness of the resulting flour. The seasonal rhythms of milling reflect the agricultural calendar of medieval life. During harvest time, the mill operates almost continuously as farmers rush to process their grain before it spoils or is damaged by pests. In winter, work slows dramatically, giving Robert time to maintain his equipment and prepare for the next year's busy season. Spring brings its own challenges, as spring floods can damage the mill's water control systems, while summer droughts can reduce water flow to levels insufficient for reliable operation. The relationship between miller and farmer is necessarily intimate, yet fraught with potential conflict. Robert must keep detailed records of who brought what grain and when, as disputes over measurements or quality are common. He develops expertise in assessing grain quality, identifying wheat that has been damaged by weather, contaminated by weeds, or adulterated with inferior grains. His reputation depends on producing consistent, high-quality flour. Yet he works with raw materials of varying quality that are often brought to him in less than ideal condition. The mill's role extends beyond simple grain processing to serve as a center of information and social interaction. Farmers waiting for their grain to be processed gather to discuss crop conditions, weather patterns, and local news. Robert, through his interactions with customers from throughout the region, often knows more about agricultural conditions and local affairs than anyone except perhaps the Lord's Reeve. This information is valuable, and Robert's discretion in sharing or withholding news can affect his relationships with customers and his standing in the community. The technical challenges of medieval milling require constant vigilance and adjustment. The millstones must be dressed regularly, a skilled process of resharpening the grooves that facilitate grinding. Too shallow, and the stones will slip over the grain without crushing it effectively. Too deep, and they will produce coarse flour filled with stone grit. The balance between the stones must be perfect. Too close together, and they will bind and possibly crack. Too far apart, and the grain will pass through unground. Water management presents another set of complex challenges. Robert must understand not just his own mill's requirements, but how his use of water affects other mills downstream. During dry periods, cooperation between mill operators becomes essential as they coordinate water usage to ensure everyone can operate. Flood periods bring their own problems, as excess water can damage mill machinery or wash away carefully constructed dams and channels. The quality of flour produced reflects not just technical skill, but an understanding of what different customers need. The Lord's household expects fine, white flour suitable for delicate pastries and white bread. Village bakers need consistent, reliable flour for daily bread production. Individual families bringing small amounts of grain may request coarser grinding that removes less of the grain's nutritional outer layers. Robert must adjust his techniques constantly to meet these varying requirements. The economic realities of mill operation create constant tension between efficiency and quality. Processing grain quickly allows more customers to be served and increases total income, but rushing the process can result in poor flour quality that damages the miller's reputation. The temptation to take more than the traditional payment is balanced against the risk of complaints to the manor lord, who depends on satisfied tenants for his own prosperity. Yet for all the suspicion that surrounds his profession, Robert possesses knowledge and skills that place him among the most technically sophisticated workers in medieval society. His understanding of mechanical principles, grain characteristics, and production processes rivals that of any craftsman. The mill he operates represents one of the most complex machines in the medieval world, requiring expertise that has been developed and refined over centuries. As autumn progresses and the harvest grain begins arriving at the mill in steady streams, Robert faces the annual challenge of processing the community's entire food supply for the coming year. But how exactly does he transform the hard kernels of wheat into the fine flour that will become bread? What ancient secrets and carefully guarded techniques turn grain into the powder that sustains medieval life? As the first light of dawn illuminates the mill on this crisp October morning in 1350, you witness Robert beginning the meticulous process that transforms Willem's carefully harvested wheat into flour. The work begins long before any grain touches the massive stones, with preparations that reveal the sophisticated understanding medieval millers possessed about their craft. Robert moves with practiced efficiency through routines developed over 20 years of daily milling, each action serving purposes that may not be immediately apparent, but are essential for producing quality flour. The preparation of the millstones themselves is perhaps the most critical and least understood aspect of medieval milling. These stones, quarried from specific geological formations prized for their hardness and grinding properties, bear intricate patterns of grooves called furrows that must be maintained with religious precision. Robert examines the stone surfaces, by lamplight, running his experienced fingers over the grinding patterns, feeling for wear or damage that could affect the flour quality. The furrows, carved in spiral patterns radiating from the center of each stone, serve multiple purposes. They guide grain toward the grinding surfaces, allow air to circulate and prevent overheating, and provide the cutting edges that actually break down the wheat kernels. The dressing of millstones, the process of resharpening and maintaining these crucial surfaces, requires tools and techniques that have remained essentially unchanged for centuries. Robert uses specialized hammers and chisels, called mill bills, to carefully deepen and sharpen the furrow patterns. This work demands extraordinary skill, as a single misplaced blow can crack a stone worth more than most farmers earn in several years. The angle and depth of each furrow must be precisely maintained to ensure even grinding and proper flour quality. You observe Robert adjusting the gap between the runner's stone and the bed stone, a setting that determines the fineness of the resulting flour. This adjustment, made through a complex system of wooden levers and iron fittings, must account for the type of grain being processed, its moisture content, and the desired characteristics of the final product. For the finest white flour, demanded by the Lord's household, the stones must be set with barely perceptible clearance between them. For coarser meal used by common villagers, a wider gap allows faster processing but produces flour with larger particle sizes. The flow of grain into the millstones is regulated by an ingenious device called the damsel, a wooden mechanism that vibrates as the stones turn, causing grain to flow steadily from the hopper above. Robert has adjusted this mechanism countless times, understanding that too rapid a feed will clog the stones while too slow a flow wastes time and reduces the mill's productivity. The rhythm of grain flow must match the rotation speed of the stones, creating a steady supply of material for grinding without overwhelming the millstone's capacity. The sound of the mill in operation tells Robert everything he needs to know about the grinding process. The deep rumble of properly operating stones creates a specific tone that changes if anything goes wrong. A higher pitch might indicate that the stones are running too close together, risking damage to both stones and grain. A grinding or scraping sound could mean that foreign objects, stones, pieces of metal, or other debris have contaminated the grain and are being crushed between the millstones. Robert's ears, trained by years of experience, can detect problems long before they become. Visible temperature control presents one of the most challenging aspects of medieval milling. The friction generated by grinding can heat the flour enough to damage its baking properties, creating an unpleasant taste and reducing the bread's quality. Robert monitors the temperature of emerging flour by touch, adjusting stone spacing and grain flow to maintain proper conditions. On particularly hot days, he may need to work more slowly or even shut down the mill temporarily to prevent overheating. The grading and sifting of flour reveals the sophisticated understanding medieval millers possessed about their product. Not all flour emerging from the millstones is of equal quality, and Robert uses a series of increasingly fine sieves to separate different grades. The finest flour, called wastel flour, passes through silk cloth and will be used for the highest quality white bread. Coarser grades, separated through screens of varying mesh sizes, serve different purposes from everyday bread to animal feed, with each grade commanding different prices in the medieval market economy. The cleaning and preparation of grain before grinding requires knowledge that Robert has accumulated through decades of experience. He can identify dozens of different weed seeds that commonly contaminate grain shipments, knowing which ones will affect flour quality and which can be tolerated in small quantities. Foreign materials must be removed, not just for quality reasons, but to protect the expensive millstones from damage. A single piece of metal or stone mixed with the grain can chip or crack millstones, potentially putting the mill out of operation for weeks while repairs are made. Water management during the grinding process requires constant attention and adjustment. The mill wheel must turn at the optimal speed to fast, and the stones will generate excessive heat. Too slow, and the grinding will be inefficient. Robert controls water flow through a complex system of gates and channels, adjusting for seasonal variations in stream flow and coordinating with other mills that share the same water source. During dry periods, he may need to work only during hours when water flow is adequate, while flood conditions might require shutting down to prevent damage to the mill's machinery. The relationship between grain moisture content and grinding quality presents daily challenges that require expert judgment. Wheat that is too wet will bind between the stones and produce gummy flour that doesn't bake properly. Grain that is too dry creates excessive dust and may produce flour that lacks the binding properties needed for good bread. Robert has learned to assess grain moisture by feel, sound, and even smell, making adjustments to his grinding technique based on the characteristics of each batch of grain. Quality control throughout the milling process involves techniques that would be recognizable to modern food processors. Robert regularly tests flour samples for fineness, color, and texture, understanding that consistent quality is essential for maintaining his reputation and his customers' satisfaction. He keeps detailed mental records of which farmers consistently bring high-quality grain and which tend to deliver wheat contaminated with weeds or damaged by poor storage. The preservation of flour after grinding presents its own set of challenges. Unlike grain, which can be stored for months if properly dried, flour is much more perishable and susceptible to insect infestation and spoilage. Robert must coordinate his production with customers' needs, grinding only what can be used relatively quickly while ensuring that enough flour is available to meet demand during peak periods, like harvest festivals and religious celebrations. The economic calculations involved in medieval milling require Robert to balance efficiency with quality, while managing complex relationships with customers who may be unable to pay immediately. During harvest time, when farmers are bringing grain for processing faster than it can be ground, he must decide which customers to serve first and how to manage the backlog without allowing grain to spoil while waiting for processing. The seasonal rhythms of milling work create periods of intense activity, alternating with slower times that allow for maintenance and preparation. During the busy harvest season, Robert may work from dawn to dusk for weeks, processing the community's entire grain supply for the coming year. Winter months provide opportunities for major maintenance projects, stone dressing, and equipment repairs that cannot be undertaken during peak operational periods. Yet, even as Robert demonstrates his mastery of the ancient art of milling, questions remain about what happens to the precious flour once it leaves his mill. How will this carefully processed powder be transformed into the bread that sustains medieval life? What skills and guild secrets await in the baker's domain, where flour and water unite with fire to create the staff of life itself? As winter approaches in this fateful year of 1350, you find yourself returning to Robert's mill during one of the most challenging periods in his career. The harvest has been processed, the community's grain transformed into flour and stored for the dark. Months ahead, but Robert's work is far from finished. The miller's role in medieval society extends beyond mere grain processing to encompass complex relationships of trust, obligation, and mutual dependence that will determine whether the community survives until spring. The accusations begin, as they do every year, shortly after the harvest processing is complete. Goodwife Aldeth complains that her flour seems lighter in weight than the grain she brought for grinding, suggesting that Robert has taken more than his fair share as payment. Young Thomas the plowman insists that the flour he received is coarser than usual, implying that the miller has mixed inferior grain with his premium wheat. These complaints, whether justified or not, reflect the fundamental tension at the heart of medieval milling. Customers must trust the miller completely. Yet that trust is rarely given freely or maintained easily. Robert's response to these accusations reveals the delicate balance he must maintain to survive in his profession. He cannot afford to ignore complaints entirely, as his reputation directly affects his livelihood and his relationship with the manor lord who granted him the milling monopoly. Yet he also cannot allow every dissatisfied customer to dictate the terms of his operation, as the economics of medieval milling require precise calculations to remain profitable. His strategy involves a combination of transparency and firmness that has evolved over years of similar disputes. You observe Robert inviting Aldeth to watch the entire milling process for her next batch of grain, demonstrating each step from initial weighing through final sifting. This transparency serves multiple purposes. It educates customers about the complexities of milling, reveals the various factors that can affect final flour weight, and demonstrates Robert's expertise and honesty. When Aldeth sees how much chaff and debris are removed from her grain, and observes the precise measurements Robert uses to calculate his multure, her complaints diminish considerably. The winter months reveal another aspect of Robert's burden: the responsibility for maintaining the mill's complex machinery. During the season when income is lowest but maintenance needs are highest, the wooden water wheel, exposed to months of freezing and thawing, requires constant attention to prevent cracked timbers that could disable the mill entirely. Robert spends long hours in the cold, replacing worn wooden paddles, tightening iron, reinforcements, and treating the wood with oils and resins to protect it from weather damage. The millstones themselves demand even more specialized attention during the inactive winter months. Robert uses this time to perform the detailed dressing work that cannot be accomplished during the busy harvest season. Working by lamplight in the cold mill, he carefully resharpens the grinding surfaces, using techniques passed down from his father and grandfather. Each stone must be perfectly balanced and aligned, as even tiny irregularities can produce poor flour or damage the expensive stones themselves. The economic pressures facing medieval millers become apparent as you observe Robert calculating his finances for the coming year. The mill monopoly that guarantees his customers also limits his ability to increase prices or expand his market. His income depends entirely on the productivity of local farms and the size of harvests, factors completely beyond his control. A poor harvest means less grain to process and lower income. Yet his fixed costs for mill maintenance and repairs remain constant. Regardless of business volume, Robert's relationship with the manor lord adds another layer of complexity to his position. As holder of the milling monopoly, the lord expects consistent income from mill operations regardless of seasonal variations or economic conditions. Robert must balance the need to maintain profitability with the obligation to serve all tenants fairly and efficiently. When disputes arise between miller and customer, the lord must mediate. often placing political considerations above strict fairness. The social isolation that characterizes the miller's life becomes more pronounced during the long winter months. While other villagers gather in the great hall for evening meals and entertainment, Robert often works alone in his mill, tending machinery and preparing for the next season's work. The suspicion that surrounds his profession extends to social relationships, as many villagers remain convinced that millers prosper at their neighbors' expense. Yet Robert's expertise makes him indispensable to the community's survival, creating a grudging respect that coexists with persistent mistrust. When the mill breaks down, as it inevitably does, the entire community depends on Robert's ability to diagnose problems and implement repairs. His knowledge of mechanical principles, gained through years of working with complex machinery, often exceeds that of the village blacksmith or carpenter, making him the final authority on technical problems that threaten the community's food supply. The seasonal cycle of mill operation requires Robert to make crucial decisions about water management that affect the entire valley. During winter, ice can block water channels or damage the mill wheel, requiring careful monitoring and intervention. Spring flooding can wash away months of careful preparation, forcing Robert to rebuild dams and channels while the community waits anxiously for mill operations to resume. Summer droughts may require negotiations with upstream mills about water-sharing arrangements that can determine whether all mills in the valley can operate successfully. Robert's role as information broker becomes particularly important during the isolated winter months. Through his interactions with customers from throughout the region, he develops comprehensive knowledge about agricultural conditions, weather patterns, and local news that makes him a valuable source of information. For the manor's administrators, his discretion in sharing or withholding information can affect grain prices, planting decisions, and even political relationships between different manors. The preservation of milling knowledge represents one of Robert's most important responsibilities, though one that receives little recognition from his contemporaries. The techniques for maintaining millstones, adjusting grinding mechanisms, and managing water flow represent centuries of accumulated expertise that must be passed down through careful training. Robert's own sons showed little interest in learning the milling trade, preferring the more respected professions of farming or craftsmanship, creating concerns about who will operate the mill in future generations. The psychological burden of the miller's profession becomes apparent as you observe Robert's daily routines. The constant suspicion of customers, the isolation from community social life, and the economic uncertainty combine to create stress that affects every aspect of his existence. Yet Robert takes pride in his expertise and his essential role in community survival, finding satisfaction in the technical challenges of his profession even when social recognition remains elusive as winter deepens and the mill stands temporarily. Idle Robert's thoughts turn to the coming year and the challenges it will bring. The grain he has processed this season will sustain the community through the dark months ahead. But its transformation into bread requires another set of skills entirely, those possessed by the village baker, whose craft combines ancient traditions with guild regulations to create the loaves that will feed medieval society. What mysteries and expertise await in the baker's domain, where flour becomes the staff of life itself? As the first snowfall of winter 1350 blankets the village of Thornwell, you find yourself entering the warm, yeast-scented world of Master Edmund, the baker, whose workshop has become the final crucial link in the chain that transforms Willem's grain into sustenance. The bakehouse, with its massive stone oven dominating one wall and shelves lined with wooden implements, polished smooth by generations of use, represents more than mere food preparation. It is the culmination of an ancient craft that combines chemistry, artistry, and guild-protected secrets to create the bread that will sustain the community through the harsh winter months ahead. The day begins long before dawn, as Edmund rises in the darkness to begin the complex process of bread making. His first task involves examining the sourdough starter that has been carefully maintained for years, perhaps decades, representing a living culture that connects today's bread to loaves baked by his predecessors. This starter, a mixture of flour and water colonized by wild yeasts and beneficial bacteria, requires daily attention and feeding to remain viable. Edmund evaluates its aroma, texture, and bubbling activity, making subtle adjustments based on factors like temperature, humidity, and the characteristics of the flour he will use today. The preparation of dough reveals the sophisticated understanding medieval bakers possessed about fermentation, though they lacked the scientific vocabulary to explain the processes they had mastered through generations of practice. Edmund combines Robert's carefully ground flour with water drawn from the village well, salt obtained from coastal regions through complex trade networks, and a portion of his precious starter. The proportions are not measured with scales or cups, but estimated through sensory evaluation, developed over years of daily practice. You observe Edmund's hands working the dough with a rhythm and technique that speaks to decades of experience. The kneading process, which seems simple to casual observers, actually serves multiple complex purposes that Edmund understands intuitively. The mechanical action develops gluten proteins that will give the bread its structure, distributes ingredients evenly throughout the mixture, and incorporates air that will contribute to the final texture. Too little kneading results in dense, heavy bread. Too much can damage the gluten structure and create tough, chewy loaves. The timing of bread production must account for the complex fermentation process that transforms simple ingredients into risen dough. Edmund has learned to read the subtle signs that indicate proper fermentation, the slightly sour aroma that develops as beneficial bacteria produce acids, the gradual increase in dew volume as yeasts generate carbon dioxide, and the change in texture that occurs as proteins break down and recombine. These processes cannot be rushed or delayed significantly without affecting the final product's quality. Temperature control presents one of the most challenging aspects of medieval baking. The fermentation rate depends heavily on ambient temperature, which varies dramatically with seasons and weather conditions. During winter months like these, Edmund must keep his dough near the warmth of the fire to maintain proper fermentation, while summer heat may require moving dough to cooler locations to prevent over-fermentation. His ability to adjust timing and techniques based on environmental conditions represents expertise that cannot be learned from books but must be developed through years of daily practice. The varieties of bread Edmund produces reflect the complex social hierarchy that governs medieval life. The finest white bread, made from carefully sifted flour and enriched with eggs and butter, is destined for the Lord's table and special occasions. This wasteful bread requires the most expensive ingredients and the greatest skill to produce properly, representing the pinnacle of the baker's art. More common is the everyday bread consumed by villagers, darker, denser loaves made from less refined flour, but still requiring considerable expertise to produce consistently. The guild system that governs Edmund's profession provides both protection and constraint that shapes every aspect of his work. The Baker's Guild, established to maintain quality standards and protect the interests of its members, sets strict rules about bread, weights, prices, and production methods. Edmund cannot simply decide to change his recipes or techniques without guild approval, as innovation might be viewed as an attempt to gain unfair advantage over fellow bakers or could potentially compromise quality standards that protect the guild's reputation. Guild regulations extend to the very tools and equipment Edmund uses in his daily work. His wooden paddles used to slide loaves into the oven must be of specific dimensions and materials. The baskets used for rising dough follow traditional patterns that ensure consistent loaf shapes and sizes. Even the method of marking loaves with distinctive symbols must conform to guild standards, as these marks serve to identify the baker responsible for each loaf and enable quality control throughout the distribution process. The economic framework. Surrounding medieval baking reveals complex relationships between bakers, customers, and regulatory authorities. The Assize of Bread, a comprehensive law governing bread production and sales, establishes precise relationships between grain prices and bread weights. When wheat becomes more expensive, bakers cannot simply raise prices. Instead, they must reduce the size of their loaves according to predetermined formulas. This system protects consumers from arbitrary price increases while ensuring that bakers can maintain profitability even when ingredient costs fluctuate. Edmund's relationship with his customers involves trust and obligation that extend far beyond simple commercial transactions. Many villagers bring their own dough to his oven for baking, paying a fee for the use of facilities they cannot afford to maintain individually. This custom requires Edmund to manage a complex schedule that accommodates dozens of different batches while ensuring that each customer's bread receives proper attention. The quality of bread produced reflects not just Edmund's skill, but his fairness in allocating oven time and attention to all customers, regardless of their social status or ability to pay premium fees. The social significance of bread in medieval life infuses Edmund's work with responsibilities that extend beyond mere food production. Bread serves as currency in many transactions, with workers often receiving part of their wages in loaves rather than coins. The quality and size of these bread payments directly affect families' nutrition and economic well-being, making Edmund's consistency and honesty crucial to community stability. The technical challenges of medieval baking require equipment and techniques that have remained essentially unchanged for centuries. Edmund's oven, built of stone and heated with wood fires, requires hours of preparation before it reaches the proper temperature for baking. The timing must be perfect to cool, and the bread will not rise properly or develop proper crust. 2. Hot, and the outside will burn before the interior cooks through. Edmund judges oven temperature not with thermometers but through experience, observing the color of the oven walls and testing with small pieces of dough or flour. The loading and unloading of the oven requires choreographed precision as Edmund uses long wooden paddles to slide dozens of loaves into the heated chamber. The arrangement of loaves within the oven affects how they bake, as areas closer to the fire receive more intense heat while corners may remain cooler. Edmund's expertise allows him to position different types of bread in locations that will produce optimal results for each variety. The seasonal rhythms of baking reflect the agricultural calendar and the social customs that govern medieval life. During harvest time, Edmund works almost continuously as the community celebrates with special breads and increased consumption. Religious festivals require particular types of bread with symbolic significance, demanding specialized recipes and techniques. The approaching Christmas season will bring its own challenges as Edmund prepares special holiday breads that require ingredients and methods used only during this sacred time as Edmund shapes tomorrow's loaves and prepares his oven for another day's baking. Questions arise about how his carefully crafted bread will reach the tables of those who need it most. What regulations and customs govern the distribution of this precious commodity? How do the loaves he creates become the daily sustenance that sustains an entire community through the dark months of winter, as December settles over the village with its shortened days and bitter cold? You find yourself witnessing the complex web of regulations, traditions, and social obligations that govern every aspect of Edmund's work as a master baker. The Guildhall, where the Bakers' Guild holds its monthly meetings, serves as both sanctuary and courthouse for the medieval baking profession, establishing rules that protect members from unfair competition while ensuring that the community receives bread of consistent quality and fair measure. The morning begins with an unexpected visit from the Guild's official inspector, Master Geoffrey, whose weathered face and flour-dusted apron mark him as a baker of considerable experience and authority. This inspection, which occurs without prior notice several times each year, will examine every aspect of Edmund's operation from ingredient quality to final product weight. You observe the careful formality of this process as Master Jeffrey systematically checks Edmund's scales against official guild standards, examines flour stores for signs of adulteration or spoilage, and weighs finished loaves to ensure compliance with the complex regulations established by the Assize of Bread. The inspection reveals the sophisticated quality control system that governs medieval baking. Each type of bread must meet specific weight requirements that vary according to current grain prices, as established by the Assize. When wheat costs 12 pence per quarter, a farthing's worth of wastel bread must weigh exactly 6 pounds and 16 shillings. Measurements that Edmund must calculate and achieve consistently despite variations in ingredient quality and environmental conditions. The penalties for producing underweight bread are severe, ranging from substantial fines to temporary suspension of baking privileges. Master Jeffrey's examination of Edmund's ingredients reveals the complex supply chains that support medieval baking. The salt used in bread production comes from coastal saltworks hundreds of miles away, transported by merchant networks that connect remote villages to international trade routes. The quality of this salt affects not just bread flavor, but preservation and fermentation characteristics, requiring Edmund to evaluate each new shipment carefully. Similarly, the honey used in special breads must meet guild standards for purity and quality, as adulterated honey can ruin entire batches of expensive holiday bread. The guild's role in regulating apprenticeship becomes apparent as Master Jeffrey interviews young Peter, who has served as Edmund's apprentice for 3 years and seeks advancement to journeyman status. This progression involves more than simply demonstrating technical skills. Peter must prove his understanding of guild regulations, his ability to calculate proper bread weights under different pricing conditions, and his knowledge of the ethical standards that govern the profession. The guild jealously guards its membership, as too many bakers in one area could reduce everyone's prosperity. You observe the intricate relationship between guild regulations and municipal law as the town Reeve arrives to witness the inspection. The Bakers' Guild operates under charter from the Lord of the Manor, but its activities must also comply with royal regulations governing trade and commerce. When conflicts arise between guild rules and royal law, resolution often requires complex negotiations that can affect baking practices throughout the region. The Reeve's presence ensures that local political considerations are represented in any decisions about guild compliance. The economic calculations required for medieval baking prove surprisingly complex as Master Jeffrey reviews Edmund's accounting records. The baker must track not just the cost of ingredients, but fluctuations in grain prices that affect bread pricing according to Assize regulations. When wheat prices rise, Edmund cannot simply charge more for his bread. Instead, he must reduce loaf weights according to predetermined formulas while maintaining the same selling price. This system protects consumers, but requires bakers to operate with razor-thin profit margins. During periods of high grain costs, the guild's insurance function becomes apparent as Master Jeffrey discusses the case of Baker William from the neighboring village, whose oven was damaged by fire last month. The guild maintains a fund contributed to by all members that provides assistance when disasters threaten a baker's livelihood. This mutual support system ensures that temporary setbacks don't permanently eliminate experienced bakers from the profession, but it also requires careful evaluation of claims to prevent abuse of the system. The training and supervision of journeymen reveals another crucial guild function as Master Jeffrey observes the work of Edmund's assistant, Thomas, who has completed his apprenticeship but has not yet achieved master status. Journeymen must work under the supervision of established masters for several years, developing the advanced skills and business knowledge needed to operate independently. The guild carefully controls the progression from journeyman to master, ensuring that new masters possess both technical expertise and financial resources. It's necessary for successful operation the regulation of bread marking and identification provides. Insight into medieval quality control systems. Each baker must mark his loaves with distinctive symbols that identify their origin, enabling customers and officials to trace any problems back to the responsible baker. Edmund's mark, a stylized wheat sheaf carved into a wooden stamp, must be registered with the guild and cannot be duplicated by other bakers. These marks serve legal as well as commercial purposes, as they provide evidence in disputes about bread quality or weight. The guild's role in maintaining trade secrets becomes apparent as Master Geoffrey reviews Edmund's compliance with restrictions on sharing certain techniques with non-guild members. The methods for achieving particular bread textures, the recipes for holiday specialties, and the techniques for managing fermentation under different conditions represent valuable intellectual property that belongs to the guild collectively. Unauthorized sharing of these secrets with competitors or non-members can result in severe penalties, including expulsion from the guild. The coordination between different guilds reveals the complex economic relationships that support medieval urban life. The Bakers' Guild must work closely with the Millers' Guild to ensure adequate flour supplies, with the Merchants' Guild to regulate grain imports, and with the Carpenters' Guild to maintain oven construction standards. When disputes arise between guilds, resolution often requires intervention by municipal authorities who must balance competing economic interests. The seasonal adjustments to guild regulations reflect the realities of medieval agricultural cycles. During harvest time, when grain is plentiful and cheap, bread weights increase according to a size formulas, allowing bakers to offer larger loaves at the same prices. Winter months may bring restrictions on certain types of bread that require scarce ingredients, ensuring that basic bread remains available to all social classes. The guild must balance these seasonal variations while maintaining consistent quality and fair pricing throughout the year. The social obligations of guild membership extend beyond commercial considerations to encompass community service and religious duties. Guild members must participate in religious processions, contribute to church maintenance, and provide bread for community celebrations and festivals. These obligations reinforce the guild's social legitimacy while ensuring that members maintain their connections to the broader community they serve. The training of apprentices reveals the guild's role in preserving and transmitting technical knowledge across generations. Young Peter's education includes not just practical baking skills, but literacy and numeracy necessary for maintaining records and calculating bread weights. The guild serves as an informal school system that provides education unavailable through other institutions, creating a skilled workforce essential to medieval economic life. Master Geoffrey's inspection concludes with approval of Edmund's operations, but also with specific recommendations for improvements in record keeping and ingredient storage. These suggestions reflect the guild's ongoing efforts to maintain and improve standards while adapting to changing economic conditions. The guild's survival depends on its ability to balance tradition with innovation, protecting established practices, while allowing for improvements that benefit both bakers and customers. As Master Geoffrey departs and Edmund returns to his daily work, the complex regulatory framework that governs medieval baking continues to shape every decision about ingredients, techniques, and pricing. But how do these carefully regulated loaves reach the community members who depend on them for survival? What customs and practices govern the distribution of bread from baker's oven to family table? As January's bitter cold grips the village, in this year of 1350, you witness the daily miracle that transforms Edmund's carefully crafted loaves into the sustenance that keeps the community alive through winter's darkest months. The distribution of bread reveals a complex social and economic system that reflects medieval society's intricate hierarchies. While the consumption patterns of different social classes illuminate the crucial role bread plays in determining not just nutrition but social status itself. The day begins before dawn as Edmund Mose opens his bakehouse to the queue of customers who have been waiting in the cold darkness. The order in which people are served reflects rigid social protocols that govern medieval life. The Lord's steward comes, first to collect the fine white bread destined for the manor's table, followed by the priest claiming loaves designated. For religious ceremonies, then merchants and craftsmen according to their wealth and status. Common villagers wait patiently for their turn, understanding that challenging this hierarchy could result in being denied service entirely. You observe the careful negotiations that occur as customers purchase their daily bread. Many transactions involve no money at all, as the medieval economy relies heavily on barter and credit arrangements. Goodwife Emma trades eggs from her chickens for a daily loaf, while Carpenter John promises future repairs to Edmund's wooden tools in exchange for his family's bread supply. These arrangements require Edmund to maintain detailed mental records of debts and credits, as written records are beyond the literacy skills of most customers. The variety of bread available reflects the sophisticated understanding medieval bakers possessed about nutrition and taste preferences across different social classes. The wasteful bread purchased by wealthy households uses flour sifted through fine silk cloth, producing white loaves with delicate texture and mild flavor. Middle-class customers prefer cocket bread, made from flour sifted through linen, offering better nutrition while maintaining respectability. Common villagers typically purchase brown bread made from coarsely ground flour that retains much of the grain's nutritional value. The pricing of bread according to the size regulations requires Edmund to perform complex calculations that account for current grain prices, bread weights, and quality levels. When wheat costs more, he cannot increase prices but must reduce loaf sizes according to predetermined formulas. This morning, with wheat prices elevated due to winter scarcity, Edmund's standard penny loaf weighs 2 pounds less than it did during the abundant harvest season, a reduction that customers accept reluctantly but cannot challenge. The timing of bread sales reveals the daily rhythms that govern medieval life. Most customers arrive early in the morning to purchase fresh bread for the day's meals. As bread storage in medieval homes is difficult and dialed bread quickly becomes stale or moldy, wealthy households may purchase larger quantities that can be stored in proper conditions, but most families must buy bread daily or go without. This dependence creates enormous pressure on Edmund to maintain consistent production regardless of personal illness or equipment problems. The quality inspection that accompanies each sale demonstrates the sophisticated evaluation criteria medieval consumers apply to their bread purchases. Customers examine crust color and texture, test the bread's weight by hefting it in their hands, and even listen to the sound it makes when tapped to assess proper baking. Edmund's reputation depends on meeting these exacting standards consistently, as dissatisfied customers can complain to guild authorities or take their business to competing bakers. The social function of Edmund's bakehouse extends far beyond simple commercial transactions to serve as a center of information exchange and community interaction. While waiting for service, customers share news about crop conditions, discuss local politics, and arrange other business dealings. Edmund, through his interactions with people from all social levels, often knows more about community affairs than anyone except the Lord's Reeve, making his bakehouse an informal center of village governance. The distribution of bread to different institutions reveals the complex obligations that bind medieval communities together. The local monastery receives a daily allocation of bread that Edmund provides as part of his religious obligations, while the manor's servants collect loaves that serve as partial payment for their labor. These institutional distributions represent significant portions of Edmund's daily production, but are required by custom and law rather than commercial considerations. The seasonal variations in bread consumption reflect the agricultural cycles that govern medieval life. During winter months like these, bread consumption increases as other food sources become scarce or expensive. Root vegetables stored from the harvest supplement bread in most meals, but the grain-based calories provided by bread remain essential for survival through the cold months. Edmund must carefully manage his flour supplies to ensure consistent bread availability until spring crops become available. The special breads required for religious observances demonstrate the cultural significance that extends far beyond mere nutrition. The approaching Feast of Candlemas will require Edmund to produce special blessed bread using recipes and techniques reserved for religious occasions. These ceremonial loaves require expensive ingredients like imported spices and fine white flour, representing community investments in spiritual as well as physical sustenance. The credit relationships that enable bread distribution reveal the complex economic networks that support medieval life. Edmund extends credit to customers during difficult periods, understanding that temporary inability to pay doesn't eliminate the need for daily bread. These arrangements require careful judgment about customers' reliability and ability to eventually repay debts, as excessive bad debt could force Edmund out of business. The Guild provides some protection through collective action against chronic non-payers, but individual bakers must make most credit decisions independently. The competition between bakers in larger towns creates additional pressures that don't affect Edmund in his rural location. Urban bakers must differentiate their products through quality, convenience, or specialized offerings, leading to innovations in bread types and baking techniques. Rural bakers like Edmund enjoy local monopolies, but face different challenges in maintaining adequate ingredient supplies and equipment in isolated locations. The preservation and storage of bread in medieval households requires techniques that have been developed over generations of experience with food scarcity. Families learn to slice bread carefully to minimize waste, use stale bread in soups and porridges, and store loaves in conditions that maximize freshness. The fear of bread spoilage drives many household decisions about meal planning and food preparation, as wasted bread can mean hunger later in the week. The nutritional role of bread in medieval diets reveals its crucial importance beyond mere sustenance. For most social classes, bread provides the majority of daily calories and serves as the foundation for every meal. The quality and quantity of bread available directly affects health, energy levels, and ability to perform physical labor, making Edmund's consistent production essential to community survival and prosperity. The legal protections surrounding bread distribution reflect medieval society's recognition of bread's crucial importance. Laws prohibit forestalling buying up bread supplies to create artificial scarcity and regrading reselling bread at inflated prices, while the assize regulations ensure that bread remains affordable even during periods of grain scarcity. These protections recognize that access to bread is essential for social stability and community survival. As Edmund's daily distribution concludes and his bakehouse empties, the loaves he has created begin their final transformation from crafted product to consumed sustenance. But what happens when these carefully regulated, skillfully crafted loaves reach the tables where they will provide the nutrition that sustains medieval life? How do the social, economic, and cultural meanings embedded in each loaf play out in the daily realities of medieval existence? As February's harsh winds howl across the village in this pivotal year of 1350, you find yourself observing the profound ways in which bread consumption reveals the intricate social hierarchies and survival strategies that quad stairkeys that define medieval life. The loaves that Edmund has crafted with such care now begin their final journey to the tables of lords and peasants alike, where the type, quality, and quantity of bread consumed will declare social status as clearly as any coat of arms or title of nobility at the manor house. You witness the elaborate ritual surrounding the consumption of the finest bread in medieval society. The Lord's table features wasteful bread so white it seems to glow in the candlelight. Its fine texture and delicate flavor, the result of flour sifted through silk and enriched with costly ingredients. This bread serves purposes far beyond nutrition. It demonstrates the Lord's wealth and status to guests, reinforces social hierarchies through its very presence, and represents the pinnacle of medieval culinary achievement. The Lord's children learn from infancy that they're right. 2. This finest bread marks their position in society's rigid structure. The serving of bread at the Lord's table follows protocols as complex as any court ceremony. The bread is presented on silver platters sliced by designated servants using knives reserved specifically for this purpose and distributed according to strict rules of precedence. Honored guests receive the choicest portions, while lesser nobles and household officials receive bread of appropriate quality for their rank. Even the breadcrumbs that fall from the Lord's table carry significance. They will be carefully collected and distributed to the poor as alms, representing both Christian charity and the Lord's beneficence. In the merchant's household, you observe a different relationship with bread that reflects the emerging middle class's complex position in medieval society. Master Richard, the cloth merchant, can afford better bread than common villagers, but must still demonstrate prudence and economy in his household management. His family consumes cocket bread, white enough to indicate prosperity, but not so refined as to suggest inappropriate social ambition. The quantity of bread served reflects the family's economic status, with generous portions indicating success while waste remains a sign of poor household management. The merchant's wife, Margot, manages bread consumption with skills that reflect her crucial role in household economy. She calculates daily bread needs based on family size, expected guests, and servants' requirements, purchasing quantities that minimize waste while ensuring adequate supplies. Her knowledge of bread storage techniques, keeping loaves in wooden chests lined with clean linen, monitoring for signs of spoilage, and using day-old bread in puddings and soups represents expertise essential for maintaining middle class prosperity at the artisan's table. Bread consumption reflects the seasonal rhythms and economic uncertainties that characterize skilled labor in medieval society. Master Thomas the carpenter enjoys better bread than common laborers during prosperous periods when construction projects provide steady income. But his family's bread quality fluctuates with work availability. During winter months, when construction slows, the household shifts to coarser, less expensive bread that still provides necessary nutrition while stretching limited resources. The artisan's approach to bread consumption reveals sophisticated strategies for managing economic uncertainty. During flush periods, excess income may be invested in higher quality bread that improves family nutrition and social standing. When work becomes scarce, the family gradually shifts to cheaper bread varieties while maintaining dignity through careful management of household resources. These adjustments require constant vigilance and planning that extends far beyond simple meal preparation in the peasant cottage. Bread consumption represents the difference between survival and starvation during the harsh winter months. Willems, family whose grain you watched grow from planted seed to harvested wheat, now faces the daily challenge of making their bread allocation last through each day's meals. The dark, coarse bread they consume contains more nutrition than the refined white bread of the nobility, but their limited quantities require careful rationing that affects every aspect of family life. The peasant family's relationship with bread reveals survival strategies developed over generations of scarcity and uncertainty. Breakfast consists of bread soaked in weak ale or milk, softening yesterday's loaves while providing liquid and calories needed for the day's labor. The midday meal combines bread with whatever other foods are available, preserved vegetables from the harvest, eggs when chickens are laying, or small amounts of cheese when available. Evening meals again center on bread, often combined with thin porridge made from grain reserved for this purpose. The allocation of bread within peasant households follows hierarchies that reflect both economic necessity and social convention. Working men receive the largest portions as their physical labor generates the income needed for family survival. Women's portions, while smaller, must sustain their roles in household management, food preparation, and childcare. Children's bread allocation varies with age and gender, with older boys often receiving more than daughters as they begin. Contributing to family labor. The quality differences in bread consumption create visible markers of social status that pervade every aspect of medieval life. The color of bread carried to work, shared with neighbors, or offered to guests immediately communicates the consumer's economic position and social aspirations. White bread suggests prosperity and refinement, while dark bread indicates either poverty or, paradoxically, sophisticated understanding of nutrition among those who can afford better but choose more healthful options. The psychological and cultural meanings attached to different bread types extend far beyond their nutritional value to encompass concepts of dignity, aspiration, and social identity. Families will sometimes sacrifice other necessities to afford better bread for special occasions. Understanding that the quality of bread served to guests reflects directly on the household's reputation and social standing. These investments in bread quality represent careful calculations about social positioning rather than simple nutritional choices. The seasonal variations in bread consumption reveal the annual cycles of abundance and scarcity that govern medieval agricultural society. During harvest time, all social classes enjoy better bread as grain prices fall and quality improves. Winter months bring gradual deterioration in bread quality for lower classes as stored grain becomes scarce and expensive. Spring presents the greatest challenges as stored supplies dwindle while new crops remain months away from harvest. The regional variations in bread consumption reflect local agricultural conditions and cultural preferences that create distinct identities for different communities. Villages and areas better suited to wheat cultivation enjoy superior bread throughout the year, while communities dependent on barley or oat cultivation must adapt to coarser bread that requires different preparation and consumption patterns. These regional differences contribute to local pride and identity. While affecting population health and economic development, the gender roles surrounding bread consumption reveal the complex responsibilities that govern medieval household management. Women bear primary responsibility for bread storage, preparation, and allocation within families, making decisions that directly affect family nutrition and economic welfare. Their expertise in managing bread resources, utilizing stale bread efficiently, and negotiating with bakers represents crucial knowledge that determines household success or failure. The religious significance of bread consumption permeates medieval society through Christian theology that identifies bread with spiritual as well as physical sustenance. The daily prayer for our daily bread reflects recognition that bread represents divine providence as much as human labor. Religious feast days require special breads that demonstrate community devotion while providing opportunities for enhanced nutrition during spiritually significant periods. The medical understanding of bread's role in health and nutrition, while lacking modern scientific knowledge, reflects centuries of observation about the relationships between bread quality, quantity, and human welfare. Medieval physicians recognized that bread provides essential energy for physical labor, while understanding that different types of bread affect digestion and overall health in distinct ways. These medical insights influence recommendations for bread consumption during illness or recovery periods, as winter deepens and stored grain supplies dwindle throughout the community. The careful calculations that govern bread consumption become increasingly critical. But how do individuals and families navigate the complex social and economic pressures that determine their access to this essential resource? What strategies do they employ to maintain dignity and survive hardship when bread, the staff of life itself, becomes scarce? As March arrives with its promise of spring but lingering winter hardships, you witness the complex economic calculations that govern every aspect of bread consumption in medieval society. The simple act of purchasing daily bread involves intricate negotiations between bakers and customers, complicated by fluctuating grain prices, seasonal scarcities, and the credit relationships that enable communities to survive periods of economic stress. In Willem's cottage, the morning begins with careful accounting as his wife Margaret calculates the family's bread budget for the coming week. With their stored grain nearly exhausted and spring planting still weeks away, every penny spent on bread must be weighed against other necessities like fuel for heating, candles for light, and the seed grain that must be preserved for planting. Margaret's calculations reveal the harsh mathematics of medieval survival. The family needs approximately 4 pounds of bread daily to maintain adequate nutrition. But their remaining coins will purchase only 3 pounds at current prices. The credit system that enables bread distribution during hard times becomes crucial as Margaret approaches Edmund's bakehouse with a proposal that will determine whether her family eats adequately this week. She offers to provide cleaning services for the bakehouse in exchange for additional bread, understanding that her labor has value even when cash is scarce. This negotiation requires delicate diplomacy, as accepting charity would damage the family's social standing, but trading services for bread maintains dignity while meeting survival needs. Edmund's decision to extend credit to customers like Margaret reflects complex calculations about risk, community obligations, and long-term business relationships. His account books, kept on wooden tally sticks marked with notches, representing different customers and amounts, record dozens of credit arrangements that enable bread distribution during the difficult spring months. These informal banking relationships make Edmund a crucial figure in community economic stability, though they also expose him to significant financial risk if customers cannot repay their debts. The seasonal fluctuations in bread pricing reveal the sophisticated economic mechanisms that medieval society developed to manage agricultural cycles. The assize of bread regulations automatically adjust bread weights as grain prices change, protecting consumers from arbitrary price increases, while ensuring bakers can maintain profitability. This morning, with wheat commanding premium prices due to spring scarcity, Edmund's standard penny loaf weighs nearly a pound less than it did during the harvest abundance, a reduction that customers understand but still find difficult to accept. The competition between different bread types creates market segmentation that allows customers to adjust their purchases based on economic circumstances. Wealthy households continue purchasing premium wastel bread regardless of price fluctuations, while middle-class families may switch between Cocket and brown bread as their budgets dictate. Peasant families like Willem's have no choice but to purchase the coarsest brown bread available, and even then must carefully ration their consumption to make purchases last. The barter economy that supplements monetary transactions becomes increasingly important as cash becomes scarce toward winter's end. You observe customers offering eggs, cheese, woven cloth, and handcrafted items in exchange for bread, with Edmund evaluating each trade based on his own household needs and the item's potential resale value. These negotiations require expertise in assessing quality and value across diverse goods, making Edmund as much a merchant as a craftsman. The guild's role in managing economic hardship becomes apparent as Master Geoffrey arrives to discuss collective action regarding customers who have accumulated substantial bread debts. The Bakers' Guild maintains informal coordination to prevent customers from accumulating unpayable debts with multiple bakers, while also providing mutual support when individual bakers face financial difficulties due to excessive credit extensions. This cooperation ensures that bread remains available throughout the community while protecting guild members from catastrophic losses. The relationship between bread consumption and labor Productivity creates feedback loops that affect the entire community's economic health. Workers who cannot afford adequate bread lack the energy needed for productive labor, reducing their earning capacity in a downward spiral that can affect entire families. Edmund observes these patterns closely, understanding that extending credit to maintain nutrition levels actually serves his long-term business interests by preserving the customer base's ability to eventually pay their debts. The storage and preservation strategies employed by different social classes reveal sophisticated approaches to managing bread resources over time. Wealthy households invest in proper storage facilities that minimize waste and spoilage, allowing them to purchase bread in larger quantities when prices are favorable. Poor families must buy bread daily due to storage limitations, forcing them to pay higher per unit costs while accepting greater risk of going without bread if daily purchases become impossible. The role of bread in wage payments creates additional complexity in medieval economic relationships. Many workers receive part of their compensation in bread rather than cash, with employers calculating bread equivalents based on current market prices. These arrangements protect workers from bread price fluctuations while ensuring that pews. Only Ruby Kiss has the luxurious texture that leaves ticks, as the luxurious texture that glides on leaves precursors like tease to see, with some of sep and sef. My leasing, my laugh, laces, dove sell. My lest, so live, we say, presect. We all say, we say, they say, cat by nud, but I said, bibesad, the besamad, I'm side say my, where I send, bus, I'm sex, it's we sek, kick it's a lups, I sek it's it's use, it's gust, sick, hotly, leak. Essential nutrition remains available even during periods of monetary scarcity. However, they also tie workers more closely to their employers and reduce flexibility in managing household budgets. The impact of weather on bread. Economics becomes dramatically apparent as late winter storms disrupt transportation networks that supply grain to local mills. When grain deliveries are delayed, bread prices increase rapidly while availability decreases, forcing communities to implement informal rationing systems. Edmund must balance customer needs against limited supplies, making decisions about allocation that can determine which families eat adequately and which go hungry. The development of creditworthiness assessments reveals the sophisticated understanding medieval communities possessed about economic relationships and risk management. Edmund evaluates potential creditors based on their employment stability, family size, past payment history, and social standing within the community. These evaluations, while informal, create systems of economic accountability that enable credit extension while minimizing losses from unpaid debts. The seasonal migration patterns that affect bread demand demonstrate the connection between agricultural cycles and urban economic activity. As spring approaches, agricultural workers begin leaving the village for seasonal employment in distant areas, reducing local bread demand while potentially disrupting credit relationships. Edmund must plan for these population fluctuations while maintaining adequate production capacity for the remaining community members. The inheritance and transfer of bread-related debts reveal how economic relationships extend across generations in medieval society. When family heads die, leaving unpaid bread debts, their survivors must negotiate with bakers about assumption of these obligations. These discussions involve complex considerations about family honor, economic capacity, and community relationships that can determine a family's social standing for years to come. The integration of bread economics with other local industries creates economic networks that support community resilience during difficult periods. Edmund's relationships with local farmers, millers, and merchants create informal supply chains that can adapt to changing conditions while maintaining essential services. These networks require constant maintenance through personal relationships and mutual obligations that extend far beyond simple commercial transactions. The role of religious institutions in bread distribution reveals another layer of economic complexity as monasteries and churches maintain charitable programs that provide bread to the desperate community members. These programs supplement commercial bread distribution while creating additional demands on local production capacity. Edmund must balance commercial sales with charitable obligations while maintaining relationships with religious authorities who can influence his social standing and business prospects as spring finally arrives and new crops begin to emerge. The community's bread economy will face different challenges related to planting, growing, and eventual harvest. But how do the social and cultural meanings of bread consumption play out in the daily realities of medieval life? What rituals, customs, and beliefs surround the bread that has sustained the community through another harsh winter? As April's warming sun begins to melt the last snows of winter 1350, you witness the profound ways in which bread transcends its role as mere sustenance to become a symbol of divine providence, social order, and cultural identity that permeates every aspect of medieval life. The loaves that began as Willem's carefully planted grain have completed their transformation into far more than food. They have become vessels carrying the hopes, fears, beliefs, and traditions that define medieval Christian society. The religious significance of bread reaches its pinnacle during the Easter season, as the community prepares for the most sacred celebration of the Christian calendar. Edmund's bakehouse becomes a center of spiritual as well as culinary activity, as he prepares the special blessed bread required for religious ceremonies. This holy bread, made from the finest flour and shaped according to ancient Christian symbols, must be crafted with ritual purity and reverence that transforms ordinary baking into sacred act. The techniques for creating these ceremonial loaves have been passed down through generations of guild bakers, preserving traditions that connect medieval Christians to the earliest days of their faith. The blessing of bread during religious services reveals the deep theological connections between physical and spiritual nourishment that govern medieval Christian thought. When the priest consecrates the altar bread during Mass, he transforms ordinary wheat flour into the body of Christ, creating a miracle that medieval believers accept with absolute faith. This transubstantiation makes bread sacred in ways that extend far beyond its nutritional value, creating reverence for all bread that influences how it is treated in daily life. The distribution of blessed bread after religious services creates community bonds that reinforce social solidarity while providing tangible benefits to those most in need. The communion bread consumed during Mass unites all Christians, regardless of social class, while the blessed bread distributed afterward acknowledges social hierarchies while ensuring that everyone receives divine nourishment. These distributions represent one of the few moments in medieval life when social barriers temporarily dissolve in recognition of shared spiritual needs. The seasonal bread traditions that mark important religious celebrations reveal the cultural significance embedded in different types of loaves throughout the liturgical year. The Easter bread, enriched with eggs and decorated with Christian symbols, celebrates resurrection and renewal while providing enhanced nutrition after the austere fasting of Lent. Christmas bread, spiced with imported seasonings and shaped into symbolic forms, represents divine abundance while demonstrating community prosperity through expensive ingredients. The role of bread in medieval hospitality customs creates obligations and opportunities that extend far beyond simple meal sharing. When travelers arrive seeking shelter, the quality and quantity of bread offered immediately communicates the host's wealth, generosity, and social standing. The guest's acceptance and appreciation of this bread acknowledges the host's courtesy, while creating bonds of mutual obligation that can influence future relationships. These bread-sharing rituals follow protocols as complex as any court ceremony, with specific meanings attached to different types of loaves and serving methods. The superstitions and folk beliefs surrounding bread preparation and consumption reveal the pre-Christian traditions that continue to influence medieval life despite official church doctrine. Edmund carefully avoids baking on certain days believed to bring bad luck, while incorporating protective charms and prayers into his daily routines. These practices blend Christian blessing with ancient customs, creating syncretic traditions that provide psychological comfort while maintaining connections to ancestral wisdom. The symbolic meanings attached to bread waste and preservation reflect moral teachings about stewardship and gratitude that pervade medieval Christian ethics. Throwing away bread is considered sinful, not just wasteful, as it represents contempt for divine providence and the labor that brought grain from field to table. Families develop elaborate techniques for utilizing every crumb, transforming stale bread into new dishes while teaching children reverence for the gifts that sustain life. The role of bread in medieval medical practice reveals the sophisticated understanding of nutrition that existed alongside religious and superstitious beliefs. Physicians prescribe different types of bread for various ailments, understanding that white bread aids digestion during illness, while coarse bread provides strength for healthy individuals. These medical applications of bread consumption demonstrate empirical knowledge gained through centuries of observation, even when explanations rely on humoral theory rather than modern nutritional science. The gender roles surrounding bread preparation and consumption create opportunities for women to exercise authority and demonstrate expertise within their prescribed social spheres. Margaret's knowledge of bread storage, her negotiations with bakers, and her management of household bread resources represent crucial skills that determine family welfare. These responsibilities provide women with economic influence and social recognition even within the constraints of medieval patriarchal society. The educational role of bread in medieval childhood reveals how fundamental knowledge about food, economy, and society is transmitted across generations. Children learn to identify bread quality, understand pricing relationships, and master the social protocols surrounding bread consumption through daily observation and participation. These lessons provide practical skills while teaching broader concepts about hierarchy, obligation, and community membership that will govern their adult lives. The artistic and decorative traditions associated with bread making demonstrate the aesthetic dimensions of medieval craftsmanship that extend beyond mere utility. Edmund's most elaborate breads feature intricate decorative elements, braided crusts, symbolic shapes, and ornate surface designs that showcase his artistic skills while creating objects of beauty for special occasions. These decorative breads serve ceremonial purposes, while providing opportunities for creative expression within the constraints of guild regulations. The regional variations in bread traditions create distinct cultural identities that connect local communities to broader geographical and ethnic traditions. The bread-making techniques, recipes, and customs practiced in Willem's village reflect centuries of local adaptation while maintaining connections to broader English, Germanic, and Celtic traditions. These regional variations contribute to community pride while preserving cultural knowledge that distinguishes one area from another. The economic symbolism of bread distribution creates visible demonstrations of social relationships and power structures that govern medieval society. When the Lord distributes bread to his tenants during festivals, he publicly acknowledges his obligations while demonstrating his wealth and authority. These ceremonial distributions reinforce social hierarchies while providing real benefits to recipients, creating spectacles that legitimize existing power. Relationships through displays of generosity. The preservation of bread-making knowledge through guild systems ensures that technical expertise and cultural traditions survive even during periods of social upheaval or economic disruption. The careful training of apprentices, the maintenance of quality standards, and the protection of trade secrets create institutional continuity that preserves essential knowledge while adapting to changing conditions. This knowledge preservation function makes guilds crucial to cultural as well as economic survival. The international connections revealed through bread, ingredients, and techniques demonstrate the global networks that support even rural medieval communities. The spices used in holiday breads, the salt essential for preservation, and the techniques borrowed from other regions create connections between Willem's village and distant lands. These connections make local bread production dependent on international trade, while bringing foreign influences into the most fundamental aspects of daily life, the life cycle rituals associated with bread. Consumption mark important transitions in individual and community life from birth to death. Christening feasts feature special breads that welcome new community members, while wedding celebrations include ceremonial loaves that symbolize fertility and abundance. Funeral meals incorporate bread that honors the deceased while comforting survivors, creating continuity between generations through shared food traditions. As spring progresses and thoughts turn to another cycle of planting, growing, and harvesting, the bread that has sustained the community through winter becomes a bridge connecting past survival to future hope. The empty grain stores will soon be replenished by new crops, but the knowledge, relationships, and traditions embodied in each loaf of bread will continue to nourish medieval society in ways that extend far beyond physical sustenance. The single loaf of bread that required the coordinated efforts of farmers, millers, bakers, and consumers represents the fundamental interdependence that characterizes medieval life. From Willem's careful planting of selected seeds through Robert's skilled grinding of precious grain, from Edmund's masterful baking to the complex distribution systems that bring bread to every table, the creation of daily bread reveals a civilization that understood, perhaps better than our own, the true cost and value of the most basic human needs in this year of 1350. As unknown challenges approach with the changing seasons, the bread that sustains medieval society carries within it the accumulated wisdom of generations who understood that survival depends not just on individual effort, but on the complex web of relationships, traditions, and shared knowledge that transforms grain into gold, flour into sustenance, and individual hunger into community survival.